welcome back to another episode of Raw Sport Interviews as part of Raw 12:51 AM's coverage of Pride Week. And today I have a good interview. I'm here with Jon Holmes. He's the senior editor of the Sky Sports F1 page, as well as being involved in a lot of LGBT advocacy within both sports media and the sporting world in general. How are you doing, Jon?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Will.
No, that's fine. Thank you for coming on. So I guess it's probably better if you sort of explain like what your job really entails, because I'm not sure I could do it justice.
Yeah, so my day job, I work for Sky Sports on the digital side of the business. I'm a senior homepage editor. So my team and I manage and sub-edit all the content that goes out on Sky Sports digital platform, so the website and the app, etc. And lots of various tasks related to that. And I also, at Sky Sports, look after our partnership with the charity Stonewall on the Rainbow Laces campaign. So I coordinate and contribute content that goes towards supporting the campaign. I've also founded and I lead on a network advocacy and consultancy group called Sports Media LGBT+.
Okay. I mean, how did you sort of get involved in sports journalism initially? I think I read you'd been involved since I think 2001, which is probably before I was born. So I guess that might make you a little bit older now.
Yeah, obviously. So this year is 20 years that I've been in the industry, so that's slightly terrifying. But I did a journalism degree at Liverpool John Moores University. As part of that, I focused on sport. I was sports editor on the student newspaper in Liverpool and did various bits of work experience related to that. And one of those was at a football website that was based in Leeds at the time. And I did bits and bits of work experience there. And then they started offering me paid shifts. So I would sort of travel over from Liverpool to Leeds to do them a couple of times a week. And then when I came out of university, they offered me a job. So I went into the industry through a football website. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess your role must be a bit more general now, as opposed to just talking about football, obviously, because you've got to manage the homepage. So you have to be looking at like multiple sports, looking at what could go on the homepage. I mean, is that right?
Yeah. So my role sort of developed into various sports over a number of years. And then towards the end of the noughties, Sky Sports took over the business and a few others that we were connected to. And then I kind of graduated up onto kind of the Sky Sports desk. And I did focus on football for several years and then sort of moved down to London to take the role that I'm in now. And yeah, you're right, that does encompass different sports. It's working with sports editors, sports journalists across all our coverage, all our output, and making sure that they've got what they need, and ensuring that their content is displayed to the optimal quality on our platforms.
I mean, would you say you prefer a more general approach to your job as opposed to like just focusing on football?
Well, I mean, football was always my first love as a sports fan, but I mean, like most people, I've got passion for pretty much all sports, really, to varying degrees. But particularly the fact that my role on the Rainbow Laces, encompasses all sports anyway. So it helps me to have that kind of that knowledge base, that visibility, that awareness about what's going on in all different sports, because this is a topic that obviously encompasses well beyond just football.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll come on to your role with sort of Rainbow Laces, your role around Stonewall, because I read your article on Sports Media LGBT Plus about how you sort of got into writing about LGBT plus sportsmen and women with your report on I think it was Robbie Rogers' autobiography coming out to play. For context, Robbie Rogers was the second person in the Premier League to come out while they were playing in the Premier League before moving to LA Galaxy to play in the MLS. How influential was it for you to start writing these articles and being able to report on like these sports people who may not have had the visibility that they might have had before?
Yeah, It's been a real journey, to be honest. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about this topic, there's a kind of a personal element to it. Like, how does it connect to you? I think we've seen, a lot of interest in the topic, in this part of diversity, in this part of inclusion in sport for a number of years, and often it's been framed around like coming out stories and kind of waiting for sportsmen and women in a particular sport to make themselves more visible. But I think the more that I was kind of on my own personal journey, learning about all the different nuances of the topic, all the complexities, why certain sports have more visibility than other sports. Obviously, the rise of women's football in this country has increased that visibility, and it's not happened yet in the men's game. All of these things sort of came into play. So it was a personal journey for me, because I was, on my own sort of coming out path. I'd gone through 12, 13 years in the sports media industry of not being out at work, and really kind of struggling at times with who I was. So I needed to sort of, get past that stage. And then, reading, as you say, Robbie's book, which I've written a little bit about for our website as part of a partnership that we've just announced with the Football Writers Association, which we're really, really pleased about. And Robbie's story really, really resonated with me. I do sort of vaguely remember, because I was about 18 at the time when, the tragedy of Justin Fashanu happened, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners will have heard about that story. And that was very much in the context of the 80s and 90s, which were really, really difficult times for LGBT people, when their rights in this country were limited. There was laws in place like Section 28, which I'm not sure if you know too much about, but essentially that prevented the topic sort of being discussed in schools and in different sort of parts of society. So we kind of gone through this whole period of no visibility. The topic was kind of a taboo. It wasn't really spoken about. And that was really, really difficult. So when Robbie Rogers came out in 2013, he wasn't actually in the Premier League at the time. I think Leeds were in the Championship, and he'd sort of had a lot of difficulties with injuries. And he kind of drifted away from the game, and I think in the time just before he kind of released a personal blog post in which he sort of came out via that method. He'd actually sort of he'd actually left Leeds. They'd kind of come to a mutual agreement that his contract would end. He'd had a bad loan spell at Stevenage, I think, and essentially sort of like fallen out of love with the game, because he had all this kind of stuff going on in his head. So he kind of shared his story, and of course it had a huge reaction across sport, across football. I think, obviously hugely different stories to that of Justin Fashanu, but people recognise in their own way all the mental health issues that challenge had brought to Robbie. And he'd been really sort of really clever, I think, wise in the way that he'd sort of described, what had happened to him. And and fortunately it did have, as you say, it had a really happy ending, because he was able to kind of resume his career back in America with LA Galaxy, went on to win the MLS. And his visibility has had, huge kind of ramifications, I think, across American sport, but also in soccer. So when his book came out, sort of telling like the whole story, and that was at the end of 2014, this was a time in my life when I was, really wanting to kind of, explore this topic in my own writing, in my own output. So that's why I wanted to write about his book, and that sort of set off a whole chain of events of Sky Sports ending up signing up for Rainbow Laces and all the content that we've done off the back of that.
Yeah, and I mean, wouldn't you just say in general that being able to write these articles probably maybe shows a change in culture, just from, like, I don't know how it was when you started, but just from then to now, would you say that there has been a change of culture regarding LGBT plus issues, just because you're able to write these articles and you're able to get so much support when you do?
Yeah, I think the problem we always had was that, certainly in men's sport, the topic was only ever really spoken about in terms of homophobia and discrimination, and obviously that's an important topic to address, but LGBT people's, their lives encompass so many more sort of different aspects of who they are, rather than just being discriminated against for being gay or lesbian or bi. So I think I was able to kind of learn much more about why people kind of access sports, and often it was more at a kind of grassroots community level, and finding out about, you know, all the inclusive clubs that we have in different sports. Some would be very well known, such as in football, such as Stonewall FC, which again a lot of people will have heard of. But actually, there's a whole kind of burgeoning scene of inclusive sport, and how people's lives have been changed by being able to find communities within sport, and meeting different people. And a lot of this is not so much on a, you know, on a competitive, certainly not on an elite level, but on a social level. Like, why do these clubs exist? Is because people gravitate to those who are like them. You know, they're looking for kind of solidarity and community. But there's some really lovely stories, like personal stories, that come with that. So it was getting the opportunity to explore that in a little bit more depth. And then at an elite level, you know, we do kind of, there are different times. I think Rainbow Laces has really helped that, because it's secured a place in the calendar where we can have a discussion about these topics in a framework that's constructive. And that's been really, really useful. But also there are lots of other different points in the calendar now that people are more aware of, such as, you know, LGBT History Month in February, Pride Month, of course, which is the time we're in now. There are other times such as Coming Out Day, which is an awareness day in October, Mental Health Week, and all these kinds of things. And people are able to talk about this part of who they are in that context. And I think that's really, really helped move the conversation forward.
Yeah, I mean, along with this, as you mentioned before, you've been involved in LGBT plus advocacy within sports journalism with the founding of Sports Media LGBT plus. Was there sort of a specific reason you wanted to found? I think it was in 2017, or has it always been an idea that you've had in the background?
Yeah, I mean, it all sort of snowballed out of work that we were doing at Sky. So when I moved down to London from Leeds, and that was in 2013, I was working for Sky at the time, you know, in their office in Leeds, but I was aware that there was like a company LGBT network, and that was mostly, of course, based down at headquarters in London and in Scotland as well, where Sky has its two kind of main campuses. And I was on kind of like a satellite base, as it were, in Leeds. And, you know, we didn't really have that. So I didn't actually know anyone else in my workplace who was LGBT. So, you know, you didn't really feel connected in the same way. But moving down to London, you know, suddenly I became part of a much wider network, was able to meet so many more people through that. So I really got that idea about what network groups can achieve, you know, how they can help to boost people's self-confidence, you know, shared goals, and just all kind of the social elements that you get out of a network group. So we'd actually been able to do a lot of this kind of groundwork with Sky Sports and Rainbow Laces when we signed up for the campaign in 2016, and that through social media as well, which is obviously, you know, great for connecting. I became aware of other people in the industry who were also LGBT, you know, who were sending messages and kind of commenting on each other's tweets and all that kind of thing. So it got to the summer of 2017, and some messages started flying around, and I said, you know, can we get a meetup? Can we have a meetup in the pub? And, you know, let's bring some people together, and let's explore whether or not there's a appetite for having a network group for LGBT people in sports media. Very much inspired by network groups that were cropping up elsewhere, such as BComs, which again I'm sure you would have heard of, the Black Collective of Media in Sport. They were doing some really great work. Women in Football, you know, lots of groups which were really sort of like forging ahead. So managed to get this group together of about 10, 11 people in the pub, and, you know, we all sort of spoke about our own journeys, and it was really, really fascinating, and you could see the appreciation and the enthusiasm behind it. So launched the group in November of that year, and it's really snowballed in the last kind of 4 years. And now we obviously, we're a digital publisher in the sense that we have a website. We try to put content out on there, and the social channels are really popular. I think we've got almost like 10,000 people follow us across the different social media platforms, which is great for something that's, you know, you might say is quite a niche sort of area of sport. But it's much more than that. It's all about the connection between those of us in kind of the core group. We also have a community group on Facebook, which has about 500 people in it, who are all not necessarily sports media practitioners, but they're sports fans who like to share news and find out about what's going on around the world. And as I say, it has become slightly global because we've got connections in Australia, Canada, America, France. So it's it's been really exciting.
So I guess you could say the aim was to always just help support other LGBT plus people within the media, because obviously they may not have been given the support they may not have been given the support before. So the aim was to like build up everyone at the same time and bring people, just make people feel more comfortable with who they are and who they were within the industry, essentially.
Yeah, and that's very much the network part of it. I think particularly for LGBT people, because it's a part of um, equality that isn't necessarily visible. Like you wouldn't often you don't know that someone's LGBT unless they choose to tell you. So finding kind of other people who've had similar experiences, shared experiences, can be slightly difficult, particularly if you're in an industry where there isn't much visibility and there hasn't been, in the wider sport landscape before, and certainly in sports media, it's something that's only really sort of grown, I think, along with the rise of social media and the fact that people can have a profile. For example, I can have like a rainbow flag emoji in my profile, and that will sort of like send out a kind of a wider message about one part of who I am. Obviously, I've become like really, really passionate about it, so it's kind of become my niche, as it were, in sports media. And not everyone, particularly wants to have that kind of niche or follow that niche. Maybe they're an expert in another area of sport, and being LGBT is just, as kind of a sidebar, really, as to a part of who they are. But at certain points, I think we all want to kind of, be a little bit more visible, because it does a lot for our confidence. It does a lot for our authenticity. There are things that we feel passionate about as LGBT people, that sometimes, is important to raise in sport, particularly, when I've spoken before about mental health and those parts of discrimination and awareness campaigns. So really the network is, hopefully it's emboldened people to kind of, navigate their own path, as to being visible in the industry. But also, I think what we've been able to do is we've been able to encourage, not just LGBT people, but allies as well, like lots of different parts of the media, such as yourself, inviting me to have a chat today, is that it's kind of created an avenue where people can actually come to this topic, have a route in to ask the questions that they want to ask. Because, and it still happens today, we find that people are worried about what to say, and they're not sure about the language and the terminology, and sometimes they're so worried about getting it wrong that they don't do anything at all. And then it goes through that cycle again of, in particular sports, where it's just not spoken about because people aren't comfortable. So we're trying to kind of help people.
Okay. I mean, do you think you've seen that the group has helped even within the last 4 years? And I guess if you have, would you be confident that it will continue helping and maybe pick up the pace in the future?
Yeah, it really has helped. I mean, there are still things that we as a group, we kind of take issue with, and so some of the media coverage, more so on the front pages of newspapers and the back pages, is kind of an area of concern for us. The way that some of these stories are framed. Obviously, we're working in an industry where there's a kind of a commercial value to selling newspapers and driving web traffic, and this particular topic is one where there is a lot of public interest. There's no doubt about it that there's a public interest in people and personalities, and because there is very little representation of LGBT people in certain sports, it means that when those stories are run in newspapers and on websites, you see the traffic, you see the interest around that, you see the social media buzz, but often as a result of that, they get sensationalized, and the stories are kind of spun in a way that actually isn't very helpful for moving forwards on inclusion. And maybe this is something that you've noticed, but it's happened a long time, particularly in tabloid journalism. It's been an ongoing sort of series and a narrative that's run for a number of years. So these are kind of areas that are sort of concerning for us. But largely, I would say, sports media has recognised that often the stories of LGBT people in sport are among the most interesting, because inevitably you're opening up about something that's very, very personal to you. And I think one of the problems that we've had as sport has become more commercialized, the lens, the focus of social media has intensified on athletes, that they're less likely to kind of open up about personal problems sometimes, and because they know that they're going to be under scrutiny. So I think journalists recognise that if an athlete or coach or somebody in sport trusts you enough to share something about maybe their mental health or a challenge that they've had to overcome away from the pitch or away from the track, or potentially their sexuality or their gender identity, these are among the most kind of, if you've been trusted to share that story with an audience, then obviously you're doing good work as a journalist. So I think all of us in the industry, we want to meet people with interesting stories. We want to help raise awareness about different areas of society and how sport impacts upon that. That's what we got into the industry for, because we're passionate about sport, but we're also passionate about the people involved in sport. So having our group, I think, has, and lots of examples of this, but we've had people, journalists, come to us for advice, come to us for connections, come to us for sort of support around the social media reactions, or the way that the headline and the image combine to kind of tell the story. There's all like different elements to it, and I think we've been able to kind of tap into the knowledge of our core group, which is probably about 30 to 40 journalists that work across print, digital, radio, TV, all got different expertise, and tap into that knowledge base, and then be able to kind of share that with people that get in touch with us to make sure that their content is as inclusive as it can be.
So, I mean, I guess you could say, as well as being like an advocacy group, it can be a support group for maybe athletes who are just still questioning, like when or if they should come out. Like, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, when you say support group, I think we're there, and we've got lots of examples of this. We're there to support them on the media part of their journey, and it is really a daunting. It's a really daunting part of that personal journey, because all of us, we come out at different stages of our lives. We come out to friends and family. We come out to people within our workplaces, and we're kind of coming out every day at times, because you meet new people. You strike up a conversation. You might learn a little bit more about the other person just through having a chat, and maybe they say, oh, are you meeting up with your girlfriend tonight? And you kind of say, actually, I'm meeting up with my boyfriend, and these kinds of, the way that people's natural conversation flows. But when you've got the prospect of sharing your news with a large group of people, the general public, and it's not just about telling one journalist and having your story run in one newspaper or one website, for example. Quite often for people in sport, they know that if they do one interview, it's going to get picked up by lots of different outlets as well. And you won't be able to speak to all of them individually, because there's too many of them. But they will take quotes from that one interview that you have done, and they will then go away and write their own story about it. And we've seen this with lots of coming out stories for people in sport. You can only come out once, from a general public perspective, and the manner in which you do it, you might choose to do it yourself on social media, or you might choose to do it through a newspaper, for example, or through a radio interview. But I think what concerns most athletes is that they're worried about not being able to control the story after it's out there. It's going to get picked up, and it might get skewed a little bit. It might get twisted. The headline might run that you're not particularly happy with. We often hear about people are concerned about being known as, quote, the gay footballer, and having their sexuality framed in that way, when actually they're a footballer who happens to be gay. If you see what I mean, there's kind of a different level of visibility, a different level of kind of labeling in those two different things. So it's understanding that and helping athletes, making sure that they're well prepared for time in their lives when they are ready to share.
Okay. I mean, yeah, sports media, LGBT plus, and the only thing that you've been involved with, you've also a part of the team at Racing Pride, a charity sort of set up in 2019. I mean, do you mind running through what the charity is sort of all about? Like, is it something sort of a bit more different to sports media, or is it sort of the same thing?
Well, it is different because Racing Pride is a movement, really, and it's a movement to increase visibility and awareness in motorsports specifically. Sports Media LGBT is, as I say, it's like an all sports network group, advocacy group, consultancy group. So they are very different things. Racing Pride came about because we had two fantastic young men, one of whom is a racing driver, one of whom is a journalist, who kind of started a conversation and wanted to do more in motorsport in general, because they'd had sort of complicated journeys, I think, at times about being visible in motorsport. There were very, very few role models, very few kind of examples of representation across, whether you're thinking about Formula One, NASCAR, British GT, all the different motorsport series that there are, and there's a huge amount. There was very, very little kind of awareness. I mean, it's always been seen as a very kind of macho, male-dominated part of sport. And I think it was an area where there was probably the most need for something that was a bit more visible and more of a movement. So they came along, had a chat with Stonewall, obviously from a Rainbow Laces perspective, and learned a little bit more about what Stonewall was doing in that space. I was brought on board because I'd done some interviews in motorsport already by that point. I think there was a former British GT driver, Danny Watts, who had gone through his whole career and come out at the end of his career and shared his story. And that had been really, really moving. And I think they were kind of energized by the positivity around Danny's story in particular. And also a fantastic advocate for not just motorsport, but the LGBT community, Charlie Martin, a racing driver who you might have heard of, who's kind of one of her career ambitions is to race at Le Mans. And if she does achieve that, racing at the Le Mans 24 hours, then she would become the first trans woman, trans driver to compete in that series. So all these kind of different individuals and elements kind of coalesced, and then Racing Pride was kind of brought together. And it's for everyone across the motorsport industry. So it's not just for drivers, not just for journalists. It's for people like race stewards, people in administration, engineers. So all those fantastic different roles that you get that make up a motorsport community, everyone's welcome. And I think it's doing really, really great work. And they've made allies, a core component of the network as well, because, allies outnumber LGBT people in motorsport to a considerable degree. So it's really important to have their support as well. So yes, we've actually moved forward quite significantly in the last month. It's kind of a partnership with Aston Martin F1, which has been really, really exciting. And I think now, Racing Pride's been going for a couple of years, and we're really excited about the future.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the partnership with Aston Martin. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but they'll have your logo on their cars for the French Grand Prix. And obviously, the drivers have been very supportive of the initiative. I think I saw on Instagram Sebastian Vettel talking about like just being who you are, supporting Pride and things like that. I mean, how important do you think it is for maybe young LGBT people to see like the role model, the drivers that they look up to, see like Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll talking about these issues, especially as F1 becomes sort of more social media orientated, especially over the last few years?
Yeah, I'd say that is the most important part, I think, of the partnership. I think we've done a lot of work in different sports of trying to kind of steer them in a direction where they recognise the importance of times in the calendar like Pride Month. Why is the LGBT community, why is Pride Month important to individuals? What's the wider message that it sends out globally? Because obviously we live in a world where LGBT rights are not as advanced in certain parts of the world as they are here in the UK and in the Western world. And a sport like F1 in particular, it has a wider diversity message around We Race as One, and the kind of the conscience that's grown, I think, off the back of Black Lives Matter and everything that happened last year, but also appreciates that for many of us, we're not just one thing. You know, there's an intersectional approach that's needed. And when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you know, you need to recognize that you've got people in your sport who are Black or from diverse ethnic communities. You've got people who are you know, have disabilities. You've got obviously you've got women in the sport who maybe have faced their own challenges with sexism and misogyny. So actually, all of these different forms of discrimination and types of equality, they all kind of intersect, and having a wider message and also recognizing the importance of all the different strands within that is really important. So to have Pride Month arrive, and for somebody like Vettel and Stroll to be able to speak confidently about why it matters, the importance of visibility, the fact that it might have friends and family who are LGBTQ, you know, the fact they might have colleagues who are part of those communities, and just to send a message of like, yes, allyship is important to us because we want everyone to be their best version of themselves at work, and when everyone is the best version of themselves at work, the team obviously succeeds and does better. That's the whole point of inclusion in the first place, is that we all achieve more when everyone can be at their very, very best. And for LGBT people, when we're closeted, when our mental health is low, when we don't feel appreciated, when we're concerned or worried about things that are said in the workplace, or things that we see on social media, or laws that are enacted against people like us, obviously that has a debilitating effect, a demoralizing effect on us, and that can be reflected in the fact that, oh, I don't really want to go into work today because, you know, I heard somebody say something yesterday and it had a really negative effect on me. You know, obviously for an employer in any area, that's really, really bad news if that happens, because you know, you've spent and invested a lot of time and money in somebody. You want them to give their best every day, and that helps you to achieve your targets. So it's a no-brainer, and that's why society, I think, has moved towards a space where inclusion is respected and you know, and encouraged. And I suppose the problem we have now is that we're kind of meeting, you know, a bit of tension, and you'll probably have, you know, read and explored a little about this kind of culture wars issue that's ongoing in different parts of society. And sport, I think, has kind of been brought into this in terms of the conversations around taking the knee and other sort of aspects of that. Is that now we're sort of seeing a tension where people, you know, some people, and it is a minority of people, are pushing back against efforts to be more inclusive because they're somehow seeing themselves threatened by it in some way, because it goes against traditions of sport, or it goes against expectations and perceptions of sport. And there's some people are trying to push back against that, and that's obviously, you know, I think that shows that the inclusion work is important and it's needed, because there are still those elements of society that don't appreciate things like LGBT visibility in motorsport, and they don't understand about the impact that it can have, the positive impact that it can have. So you see all these stupid phrases like thrown around, like virtue signaling and wokery, which essentially is kind of like it's the dying sort of screams of the past, you know, and it's like the death throes of the past that we're trying to leave behind. But I think even though there are certain parts of the media where those voices are more prominent, I think, you know, everyone is moving towards a space where inclusion trumps everything.
So yeah, I completely agree with you. But do you think maybe F1 in particular should be doing a bit more? I know they're doing a lot already, but obviously we still race in countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Russia, China, where LGBT rights are slim to non-existent. So do you think that F1 can be doing more to challenge just the narrative in these countries that like we race in year on year?
Well, I mean, I always think that people can do more, and that's one of the reasons why Sports Media LGBT is there, because we like to encourage people to be more active and to talk about. But it comes down to supporting individuals, and every sport is on its own journey. So the fact that F1 races in places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, I mean, they're not the only sport, of course, that has events or has people representing their countries in those places, and might find it difficult for a variety of reasons. But I think what it does is that those countries have put themselves forward to host these events, and with that comes a level of scrutiny that they have to be prepared to undergo. And I think we'll see that particularly around the World Cup in Qatar late next year. FIFA and UEFA, for example, they have now introduced elements into their charters that underline the importance of equality around sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, clearly, there's a conflict there between the laws of those countries and the charters of the sports associations. I don't necessarily, in an ideal world, yes, I think a World Cup should be hosted in countries where everyone can go to watch the tournament and feel like they can be themselves, and not feel like they are at risk in any way. That's clearly not something that is good for that sport or for that tournament. But also, there's a different way of looking at it and say, actually, how can we use sport? How can we talk about sport in a way that moves the conversation forward? So we're not going to change the laws in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia through sport necessarily, but we can help to move the conversation forward, and we can help to raise education and raise awareness about what it means to be LGBT. Because I think in these countries there's still a perception about being LGBT means to be only one type of man or one type of woman, and then of course you've got questions around people who are non-binary, and they might not understand that. If we can use sport as a way to raise the education levels in those countries and help LGBT people who live there, that's the most important thing. Then sport can ultimately have a good impact in those places. But also, it's inordinately difficult to do that. I mean, we've seen the World Cup in Russia. I think there was actually some visibility around the World Cup in Russia, and I think we did speak about these issues. But here we are 3 years afterwards. Life is no better, for LGBT people in Russia, or particularly in Chechnya, and we have to accept that. So there's only so much that sport can do, but if sport is prepared to kind of have that conversation and to talk about the issues, then ultimately that's probably better than not having it spoken about at all.
Okay. I mean, I think we're running a bit low on time, so I'll just finish off with one final question. Have you got any words of advice for maybe young, aspiring LGBT plus sports journalists, just to just give them some advice over what they could be doing and how they can express themselves in the best way possible?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of spoke about this a little bit the other day at the Football Writers Association panel event that we put on. So I sort of encourage people to maybe have a watch of that, because it's got contributions from people like Nikki Bandini, Adam Crafton, Ian Sanderson. But I think all of them sort of came from the place that, actually our industry, I think we're quite confident that our industry is very welcoming and inclusive. And no doubt there are going to be people who have had negative experiences. But from everything that we hear as a network group, we're not inundated with people that are coming to us saying, I've had a terrible experience in sports journalism or in football journalism because I'm LGBT. I mean, that doesn't happen. If anything, it's to the contrary. We're hearing people who are trying to get into the industry and finding that being LGBT is actually seen as not necessarily something that you'd put on your CV, but it gives you an awareness and an understanding about matters related to diversity and inclusion in sport. And that's a topic that all editors, should and naturally would be interested in, because it leads to informative content. It leads to potentially breaking new stories and finding new narratives within sport. And that should be something that every media publisher, outlet, editor would want to do. So find a way where you can speak and write about the things that you're most passionate about. And if you're the expert on your League Two club, or you're an expert on, Championship Rugby League because you support one of those clubs, or anything like that, focus on where your expertise is, and you will find work, through that. That's the thing that I would always recommend. I don't think it's great these days to be necessarily a jack of all trades. I think that can get you a certain level of work, but it's really good to have a specialism and to be able to be kind of a go-to person for a certain area of sport. And then hopefully you'll find, as your confidence grows and you learn about the people that you work with, and try to find a way that you can actually, mention or write about being LGBT in sport related to that area of your specialism and the sports that you're passionate about. And I think we've seen that in various members of our network group over time have felt able to kind of recognize that they are in a position where they can move these things on, and that they can contribute in their own way through the media through the output that they produce.
Okay, I mean, thank you for, I think that's all. So thank you for the interview. I'll just read out some of the Twitter handles where people can go and check out. So Sports Media LGBT Plus is at Sports Media LGBT, while Racing Pride Twitter is at Racing Point HQ. Thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to interview you.
Thanks, Will. It's been really good.
Thank you. Right. Yeah, that's everything. This has been Raw Sport Interviews.